Are wildlife and nature-focused webcams simply a novelty or windows of inspiration? If you're an avid watcher of the cams on explore.org, you probably feel that it's the latter. Yet, there's very little research about the role that webcams and individual wild animals play in generating public support for conservation. Hi, everyone. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Soon after I began interacting with the bear cam audience on explore.org in 2013, I became convinced that webcams are powerful conservation tools. They bridge many of the barriers that prevent people from experiencing parks, wildlife, and wildlands in person, and allow people all over the world to have a meaningful wildlife watching experience. Still, I had a lot of questions about the webcam experience. In particular, I wondered if a person's connections to the individual bears seen on the bear cams translated to greater overall support for conservation of bears and their habitats. Thankfully, I wasn't the only person who was curious to find an answer. Today, I'm joined by my research colleagues for the bear cam surveys that we opened to the public in the summer of 2019 and 2020. Dr. Lynn Lewis is a professor of economics at Bates College in Maine. Dr. Leslie Richardson is an economist with the National Park Service. And Dr. Jeffrey Skibbons is a professor of recreation and park management at East Carolina University in North Carolina. They are here to explore the methods and some of the results of our survey, as well as the implications of our findings for wildlife conservation. So Lynn, Leslie, Jeff, great to speak with you once again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I am very curious to know one thing about you, and I don't know if I've asked this of you before. Maybe, Lynn, I'll start with you, and then we can jump to Leslie and Jeff. How did you find yourself interested in the bear cams?
Oh, wow. I discovered the bear cams in July of 2014, and I was immediately mesmerized. I remember watching a bear who I would come to learn was 89 backpack sitting on a rock for hours near the falls. And I watched a beautiful bear who sat on the far wall and was very successful fishing. And of course, people just gushed about this bear. So that was 480 Otis. And the next season, I saw the most amazing thing. I saw a lone cub that got adopted by who I learned was Holly and her koi, and watched her raise them for 2 summers. And to say I was hooked is kind of an understatement. I needed to see this place. But I'm also an environmental economist, and I study human behavior and how people value the environment. So I started to wonder how the ability to identify with individual animals influences conservation behavior and willingness to pay for conservation. And when I finally got to Brooks Camp in 2018, these thoughts kept simmering and developed into research questions. And as you likely recall, when I got home, I reached out to you via Twitter, and that conversation led to this collaboration.
And Leslie, what about you? You've worked for the National Park Service for several years, so you've been looking at other wild animals in different national parks, but I'm curious about your story with the bear cams.
Yeah, I think I'm personally fascinated with bears and wildlife generally, and I take every opportunity that I can to watch wildlife. So I was really excited when I first learned about the bear cams back in 2015, I think it was. And I'm also really interested in learning more about how people engage with our parks and our park wildlife virtually. I think webcams are a great way to share our public lands with a wide audience. And they really allow people to stay connected to places they've been and experience and learn about places and wildlife they may not be able to see in person. And the fact that you can get up close and personal and learn so much about these bears on the webcams and witness behaviors that most of us will never see in person is just incredible.
And finally, Jeff, I'll throw this this out to you as well. You actually have some experience surveying at Katmai National Park beforehand, but were the bear cams kind of like your first interest in national parks? I think you've had a lot of experience doing other things as well. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of a two-prong approach. So we had been doing some projects for national parks and protected areas throughout the country on some other broader wildlife issues, and were approached by the folks at Katmai who had some questions about other aspects of visitor management and wildlife interactions. and kind of out of nowhere said, "Hey, have you thought about the bear cams at all?" And my team and I were a little unfamiliar with it. We said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And kind of explain it more. And so we got into it from very much of a sort of a practical or scientific approach from the beginning, and then of course had all those great experiences like Lynn and Leslie mentioned, where you sit down and start watching and you're just blown away by these views. And so we were fortunate enough to help the park with some studies looking at the impacts of viewing the webcams and comparing it to the on-site visitors. So we're able to talk to folks both while they were there on site and then also as they were watching online and get some general information behind that, and then have been fortunate now to continue with this project, looking at it on a much broader scale.
Let's talk about the premise of the research now. The vast majority of wildlife conservation science focuses on entire populations of animals or substantial changes in those populations. So how can the surveys of webcam audiences help aid conservation?
I think the bear cams offer a unique opportunity to watch and learn about individual bears. And I think this connection helps us understand the importance of conservation and perhaps even value conservation more. From an economic standpoint, there have been a few studies looking at how the public values things like the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone or preventing the extinction of some endangered species. But there's not much out there about how people value animals at the individual level. So that was an important focus of this research.
And what separated the Bear Cam survey from the bulk of the existing research? Jeff, would you kind of agree that it's really kind of like that focus on the individual that we tried to tease out in this survey?
It is. These are a great new tool for conservationists and land managers to begin exploring. Some preliminary research that we've conducted has demonstrated that viewers online are capable of having very positive and strong responses and aligned to the desired conservation outcomes from watching the webcams. So now peeling back another layer and really digging into the individual nature of it, because it is a little bit more of a structured experience compared to being on site where you're very much at the whim of the bears, whereas having the bear cam streaming, you have a little bit more control, and there's also some focus that's derived from where the cameras are. And so that lends itself to helping visitors connect with individual animals. And so now what we're trying to see is how has that individual connection really become a driver for some of the other experiences that would be analogous to being on site.
And Lynn, why did we survey across 2 summers? Our original plan wasn't to do that.
That's right, it wasn't. Our original plan was, I believe, to survey on site in 2020, but clearly that couldn't happen given the pandemic. However, both Explore.org and our research team were really interested in how the pandemic affected wildlife watching. Most of us were stuck at home on screens, and perhaps not surprisingly, there were many new viewers to the bear cams. Many of the comments we received suggested that wildlife viewing provided a needed relief and some joy to a very stressful year, and to both new viewers and seasoned viewers. But many new viewers discovered the cams because they were at home.
And there was a major part of the survey that focused on like a scenario associated with the threats to bears in the Katmai region. So Leslie, can you explain the design of that section and what you were aiming to measure?
Yeah, so as environmental economists, Lynn and I are really interested in understanding how people value our public lands and the resources they support. We know wildlife is important to a lot of people, but we don't have much information about the economic benefits associated with the preservation of wildlife in our national parks. So Katmai's brown bears in this example. So that's what we were really trying to measure here. And, economics is, of course, just one way to look at the value of wildlife, but putting things in dollar terms by asking people what they would be willing to pay for the conservation of brown bears, it really helps us understand the value they place on that resource in a way that allows it to be compared to other things that people value.
And Lynn, the scenario that you and Leslie developed was hypothetical, but it was also very realistic. So why did the scenario need to be so realistic?
Well, we want an honest answer from respondents, so we need the scenario to be the most realistic. And in order to elicit a true value or a true willingness to pay, as we say in economics, we need that scenario to be believable and realistic. So we did ask questions after our scenario about whether respondents believed the results of the survey could affect the decisions about how Katmai bears are protected. And we asked whether they understood all the information presented to them. And most of our respondents did understand the information and believed the scenario and had confidence that the Preservation Trust Fund could achieve its goals of protecting individual bears. But before we calculated a value for a brown bear, we removed those respondents who did not believe or understand our scenario.
And what did you discover from the survey answers? Maybe Leslie, or excuse me, Lynn, I can throw that one back to you.
Yeah, no, we found a very high value for Katmai's brown bears. In fact, we found a willingness to pay to protect one brown bear of $70 per person per year. In other words, we calculated an average value of $70 per person to avoid the loss of an individual bear. And multiplying this number by the number of respondents in our survey resulted in a value of $260,000 to avoid the loss of one brown bear. And we calculated a premium of an additional $40,000 for a bear they've seen on screen. So this is pretty remarkable.
Those are some pretty incredible numbers, and I think that helps to illustrate just how much we value, these animals in our own lives, whether we're, standing on the platforms at Katmai, or if we're watching, halfway around the world. Another part of the survey, though, was Jeff, that you were particularly, focused on, was about a respondent's attitude towards bears and conservation. For example, we asked participants to indicate whether they agreed or disagreed with statements such as, "I need to learn everything I can about brown bears." Another example of a statement we asked people to respond to was, "I will alter my lifestyle to protect brown bears." And you've asked similar or the exact same questions in surveys about wildlife in other national parks. How do the webcam survey results compare to those surveys of on-site visitors who get to see animals in person?
It was quite shocking. They came out statistically equivalent or higher in many instances, and so when we look at comparisons with those exact questions and other questions associated with that, and we can do comparisons to other bear viewing at other national parks and forests throughout the U.S., as well as comparing it to other large animals on a global scale, such as large wildlife in Africa, very iconic wildlife in Australia, marine wildlife that we see in the Galapagos. They came out at those equivalent levels of these once in a lifetime vacations and trips that people are able to go on specifically to see these animals. We're seeing results that are parallel just by watching them through explore.org. So the impact is really impressive and is delivering some wonderful benefits for people.
And one aspect of the survey results that you're still analyzing is something called conservation caring. What is conservation caring, and what can it tell us about the attitudes of, let's say, the webcam audience toward bears?
Sure. So, so Lynn and Leslie have indicated that they're environmental economists, and so one of the broad categorizations for the work that I do is as a conservation psychologist, and specifically within that, then what I look at are two sort of key dimensions of how people interact with nature, which is how you care for something and how you care about something. And these two seemingly similar topics give us a way to really sort of understand two key dimensions of how people have an interaction with nature or wildlife. And so some of the questions, like we just mentioned, talking about altering your lifestyle or wanting to learn more about that, those are examples of how you would care for something by altering your lifestyle, or care about something by wanting to learn more about it and have sort of that knowledge gain and increase your awareness. And so conservation caring is a measurement that we can collect by surveying visitors and online viewers of emotional connection they have to a specific animal. And so in this instance, we were able to do that and get a measurement of how emotionally connected the webcam viewers are to the bears at Katmai. And we were able to do this broadly for all the bears that they saw on the webcam collectively, but also then individually by looking at the individual animals that people were able to identify and come up with a measurement for each one of those specific bears. And so it's really given us some exciting new data that has previously not been available in the literature.
And we'll get to the individual animals and how that relates to conservation caring and the economics analysis in just a little bit. But in general, Jeff, regarding the conservation caring analysis, what has that just broadly suggested when you're looking at those numbers?
So people are able to form really strong and high connections to the bears from watching them on the webcams. The results that we're seeing, again, the looking at just the bears on the webcam, the results indicate a very strong and high level of emotional connection people are able to form, and this is again parallel and essentially indistinguishable from the results that would happen from being on site.
And let's talk about the effect of the individual animal for the results of our survey. That was kind of an important part, that we really wanted to measure how individual animals affect people's attitudes towards conservation. So, Lynn, I'll throw this one out to you. What has the survey illuminated about the value of individual animals? You mentioned a bit of a premium earlier.
Yeah, so the bear cams help people connect with individuals, and the interpretation programs do the same as people learn about individuals and their lives. And some viewers expressed willingness to pay more for bears that they recognized. Over half our respondents have a favorite bear or bears. And we found people watch longer when a bear they can identify is on the screen. And in general, people who said they're able to identify bears were willing to pay more into the trust fund. So we were able to calculate a premium for bears that respondents had viewed on the screen. Very popular bears like 480 Otis or Holly or 503, they pull up the value of the average bear, it turns out. So we're currently developing a model of wildlife viewing that explicitly incorporates the idea that wildlife watchers consider some individuals within a population as more charismatic, or perhaps more interesting. And so that raises the value of the entire animal population. And this has important implications for determining compensation in cases of accidental death of an animal or intentional death of an animal. And it's an improvement, in our opinion, to current approaches to wildlife valuation.
Jeff, what about the conservation caring element and individual bears? How does a person's connection to individuals influence conservation caring scores?
So we saw a tremendous increase in conservation caring scores for individuals who could identify specific animals on screen compared to those who couldn't. So the ability of an individual, of a human, to watch these webcams and identify specific bears was a strong stimulus in increasing their ability to connect to these animals and to form that emotional response. And one of the key reasons we look at that is because conservation caring as a measurement within models that we can develop is a strong indicator of behaviors that people are willing to do. So it indicates to us, it gives us another way to help with the economic data, for example, to say how likely are people to donate extra money, so we can figure out how much money they are willing to donate, and also what's the likelihood of them being able to do that. And so we have a nice kind of 1-2 punch in helping to understand all of these impacts. And again, coming back to the ability to look at an individual bear and to see Otis or Holly or Bead Nose on the cameras is very powerful and is very effective at helping people relate to these animals and form those connections we're looking for.
I'm very, eager to to really see these results published in peer review for everyone to read. And we'll be doing some follow-up stuff, I'm sure, on the cams to help our audience, many of you who participated in the survey, to understand these results even better. But just some final questions for everyone now. What's the potential, for this study, going forward? Leslie, how can we maybe apply the value of bears and individual bears to wildlife conservation?
Yeah, I think, from this survey, we found that people understood the willingness to pay question, and they do place an economic value on the preservation of bears at the individual level. We didn't really have any information on this, so this research was very helpful. And while Katmai's bears are, of course, pretty unique, we're hoping to use a similar approach to look at the value of other wildlife species in other parks potentially. And we can use these types of economic benefit measures to evaluate regulations that affect wildlife, or as Lynn mentioned, to assess the damages when animals are unfortunately either intentionally or accidentally killed in national parks. While Katmai luckily doesn't have a big problem with this, many other parks do. So understanding the loss to the public when this happens is really important.
And for me, knowing more about how people are connecting the individual bears helps, I think, inform my interpretation of the bears themselves. If I can give people the tools overall to recognize like Otis or Holly or 503, a lot of those really charismatic bears that we've mentioned, that seems to be really kind of like a gateway to people connecting with the larger population and wanting to protect the larger population of bears, not only in Katmai, but elsewhere. And Jeff, I'm wondering too, like if you have any opinions on that, how might we apply this information, those conservation carrying scores, to help promote wildlife conservation?
That's the one of the $1 million questions that we have going, of course, that is ongoing. I think, as we develop this database that we have now and look at these results coming in, it will help to inform both on-site managers as well as webcam development and conservationists at a much broader scale. If we think about the impact of wildlife tourism in general, because of course coming to see wildlife in our parks is one of the main reasons people visit national parks. And so if we can better understand some of those motivations and attitudes of our visitors, of what they're trying to come see and how we can make that a better experience, both online and on site, we can begin to raise the conservation impact of visits and help visitors engage in conservation efforts and management approaches that will benefit wildlife in the long run.
So what are our next steps? How can we, further, this type of study and research?
It's just a couple thoughts. In this survey, many viewers expressed that they watch the cams longer when a bear they can identify is on the screen. So we're curious to dig into that a little bit more. And we also want to continue to explore the way people connect to animals in national parks. Similar to Katmai, in parks such as Yellowstone, many of the individual bears and wolves are identified by photographers and visitors. At Assateague Island National Seashore in Maryland, many of the horses are given nicknames or ID numbers. So we're curious to understand how this affects the way people value wildlife in national parks generally.
And I think too that if we look at beginning to explore other opportunities for webcams and also take this experience a little bit more broadly and see how this affects visitors to sites internationally and how this could help contribute to parks and protected areas as well as zoos and aquariums on more of a global scale, we can see some impacts that everybody could benefit from.
And I also think that we're just digging into the 2020 pandemic related data. So it'll be interesting to see how the 2020 affected some of our results.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm grateful that you were able to take the time to explore and explain, some of these results with the BearCam audience, many of whom were very generous with their time. Thousands of you, thank you very much. You're very generous with your time to fill out that survey and help us give us this information, and we can help better protect wildlife and wildlands everywhere. But yeah, once again, thanks, Jeff, Leslie, Lynn. I'm looking forward to seeing what else we can discover through this information.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Lynn Lewis. She's a professor of economics at Bates College in Maine. Dr. Leslie Richardson is an economist with the National Park Service. And Dr. Jeffrey Skibbons is a professor of recreation and park management at East Carolina University in North Carolina. Have webcams like Explore.org's bear cams changed your attitude towards conservation, particularly the conservation of bears, salmon, and national parks? If that's the case, you can let us know in the comments in the chat below the live camera feed. This is an area of wildlife conservation that is ripe for further study. And it's become increasingly clear that people's connections to individual animals matter in the effort to conserve species, and that webcams have an important role to play in that effort. My name is Mike Fitz. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, as we like to say at explore.org, never stop learning.